Greetings once again. My name is Andrew Conlog, and I'm here with my segment, Andrew Explains It All, where I talk to you a little bit about a subject of interest to me, about Tucson and Southern Arizona and that type of thing. And by the end of it, hopefully you know all of it and can speak authoritatively on the subject. And today, oh man, I have got a good one for you. This guy that I'm going to talk about is one of my favorite guys ever in history. He's closely associated, pardon me. See, I'm so excited I can't even talk. Associated with Tucson, but I would love him anyway. He's fantastic. His name is George Hand, and he was more famous in Tucson even recently than he is now, which is unfortunate because he's pretty cool. Basically, what he's known for is he was a saloon keeper in Tucson in the 1870s, 1880s, and he kept a diary of his life, which is just fascinating. And don't worry, I'm going to get to the diary, but first I kind of want to talk about George and his life and experiences that led him to be here in Tucson. So George was born in Oneida County, New York in 1830. And as a young man, like a lot of young men back east, he got the gold fever and went out to California as one of the 49ers in the gold rush. And apparently he did fine, no problems there, actually did pretty okay by himself. But then in 1861, the Civil War broke out, and to hear his own account of it, he was sort of taken with patriotic fervor, and he wanted to serve his country. And that's what he did. He volunteered for the Union Army. Since it was a volunteer regiment, he was made a sergeant. He was actually voted as a sergeant by his fellow soldiers, partly because he was a little older, partly because he could read, and partly because apparently he was just a nice guy. So he was Sergeant George Hand of the California Column. I mentioned the California Column in my previous segment, but basically the California Column was a group of Union soldiers who were sent to drive out the Confederates from the bottom half of Arizona and New Mexico that they'd been occupying, and then go on, hopefully, to fight the Confederates in Texas. And what they did was got into a lot of interesting adventures. They crossed the deserts and got into a tiny little skirmish at Picacho Peak and took over Tucson without a shot being fired, and actually got involved in a pretty big battle, not with Confederates, but with Apaches at Apache Pass, which is like on the border of Arizona and New Mexico. It's called the Battle of Apache Pass. Incidentally, that is the title of a film from the 50s, 60s era of that type of Western filmmaking where the Native Americans are not played by Native Americans, and it's inaccurate and it's a bad deal. Anyway, back to George, who did not participate in any of that. He didn't really have any adventures at all. He crossed the desert and he was in Tucson for a while. And then for most of the war, he was in New Mexico. There's kind of a garrison of soldiers there to prevent the Texans from trying to reconquer New Mexico and Arizona. And they never did, so good job, George. I mean, he got into some trouble. He was, put in the stockade a couple of times and apparently rescued like a Native American girl who was being held in some kind of debt slavery by a local family. Whatever, just Sergeant George Hand's adventures. But eventually he was mustered out and kind of kicked around the Southwest for a while after that. Eventually he found his way back to Tucson, and a lot of the California Column veterans actually sort of settled in Tucson and became prominent folks. And through those connections, he got hooked up with a guy named George Foster, two Georges starting a saloon together, and that's just what they did. And that is when his diary comes from. And boy, is it interesting. I'm gonna get to it, I promise. But just as kind of a coda of George's life, he was the janitor of the Pima County Courthouse after his saloon business kind of petered out. And was by all counts just kind of a nice old salt who people like to talk to. And when he died, he was buried in Evergreen Cemetery over on Oracle, where he's buried with other veterans of the Civil War in the Union Army. Now to the diary. He actually did keep a diary when he was in the California Column and then stopped keeping a diary. And he actually expressed regret that he stopped keeping the diary. And when he started again, which when he was the saloon keeper, I'm sure glad he did. And a lot of other people were too. Actually, entries from his diary were put into the Arizona Daily Star starting in the 1920s. And those ran all the way up to the 1970s. Of course, though, since it was a newspaper, all the off-color stuff, of which there is a lot, was cut out. but I guess that's neither here nor there at this point. Also, if you're interested in the actual physical copies of the diaries themselves, they are lovingly cared for by the Arizona Historical Society. Now, as to George's diary, which my source is this compilation of the diaries in a book called Whiskey, Six Guns, and Red Light Ladies, which is edited by Neil Carmody, it is just makes for fascinating reading. And one reason is because you really get the history of Tucson at this time, and you also really get even kind of the wider history of the world, which is interesting. It was fascinating reading it during this election season. Actually, in 1876, there was an eerily similar election that in many ways was even worse and more divisive. The Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College to the Republican challenger Rutherford B. Hayes, actually by a single electoral vote, won. Under circumstances that were not even questionably dubious. They were dubious, they were bad news. And it's just interesting to hear what George has to say about that. He was very involved in politics. He was a lifelong Republican, as a lot of Union veterans were. For example, here on November 8th, which was right around the time of the election, he says, all sorts of rumors are afloat. Some telegrams say that Tilden carried several northern states. Others say Hayes has got them all. And you also have to remember that, there's telegrams that have, a limited amount of information, but that papers, had to be kind of delivered by horses or by rail, so there was not a lot of instant connection, which is evident also from November 16th, where he says, stage came in, no news. None of the telegrams about the election is reliable. No one knows who is in and who is out. There is lots of talk of trouble in the states, which is also interesting. He kind of delineates these territory guys from the, I guess, sort of tenderfoots in the states. But the best part about George's diaries and what he devotes most of the time to is just talking about his own insane life, which was really crazy. He was just like an old, weird drunk, basically. The vast majority of his diary is his adventures in the saloon, being drunk with his friends. If you've ever seen It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, picture like that crossed with gun smoke, and you've got it. You really have it. One of my favorite idiosyncrasies is that when he procured the services of a prostitute, at the end of his diary entry, he would just write her name and followed by a dash and the amount of money that it cost him. By his diary, one of his favorites was a woman that he lovingly referred to as Big Carmel. And with that, I want to read you a couple of my favorite entries here. This is just kind of a typical day in the life of George Hand from April 5th, 1876. Fine day. Everyone is tight, which means drunk. We are having great arguments on fish and fishing. Hunt is on a kind of spree and all his fishing and sailoring. Sanders got pretty full, which means drunk, and struck a friend of his from Texas. Also, any kind of thing that you don't know what it quite might mean, like tight and full, it means drunk. Basically, every weird word he used means drunk. But there he is. He's just fighting with his friends about fishing and sailing for no discernible reasons, and a guy socked another guy. And that's actually most of his existence. Of course, there were special days, like All Hallows Eve, Halloween in 1876. George writes, colder. There was a funeral today of a child who was burned to a crisp in bed. I put up the stove this evening. So Halloween gets pretty real in Tucson. Actually, life in general gets pretty real. He'll occasionally allude in that sort of very dry way to very dark stuff happening, like smallpox and death and attacks and things. But not always doom and gloom. Take, for example, the wonderful holiday of Christmas, particularly Christmas Eve on the same year, 1876, where George writes, fine day, very dull in the house until night when everyone got full of whiskey. Fighting was then the order of the day. There were several fights and more fighting talk. I went to church at midnight. The streets were full of drunken men all night, and I went to bed at 1:30 o'clock. There you go. So that's George Hand's Christmas, a George Hand Christmas. I would also like to just talk, if you'll permit me, a couple more entries that are just my favorite. Back in time to the same year, 1876, on September 1st of that year, George writes one word, and that word is drunk. The next day, September 2nd, he writes another word. It is the same word, drunk. On September 3rd, which sort of the internal accounting of this version of the Dryer Notes is a Sunday, he writes another one-word entry. It is also drunk. And then finally, on September 4th, he begins his entry with drunk, and then says he went to a feast. And then it kind of goes on from there. But I just love to imagine what was going on and what possessed this man to just be ostensibly blitzed out of his mind for days, the better part of a week. But, you know, he was able to stumble in his diary and write the word drunk. And then finally, for a final little entry here, probably, I don't know if it's my favorite, but I think it encapsulates the spirit of George Hand the best. Skipping back to 1875 on August the 30th, George writes, "I was drunk early and late, drunk all day, very drunk, disgustingly drunk. Everyone is drunk. I went to the plaza, stayed 5 minutes, came home, and went to bed. Refugia, $1. It might be Refugia, actually, I'm not sure. But the point is that is a prostitute that he hired for the price of a single dollar. If you liked George Hand, which I sure hope you did, I would encourage you to find this book. It's a little hard to find, but you know, it's kind of a Tucson local, so you can probably dig it up somewhere. I also would encourage you here for the modern technological age to follow George on Twitter. Yes, he has a Twitter account that tweets every day with the day of the year matching a day in the life of George Hand. You can follow him at AZ Saloon Diary. That's capital AZ, capital S Saloon, capital D Diary. And to answer the two questions you certainly have, yes, it is I who is managing that account because I love George and want him to be spread to the world. And yes, he does have a very devoted, although very small following of artistic types from New York City. That is all for today for Andrew Explains It All. This is Andrew Conlog, signing off.